The Caribbean Sea in the early 1700s wasn't just a place of cannonballs and gold doubloons. It was also a place where a missing sock could cost you your life. Most people think of pirates as lawless wild men with parrots and pistols, but the truth is quieter and stranger. Piracy during the so-called Golden Age was, in many cases, more regulated than the Royal Navy. Pirates didn't just write rules, they lived by them. And among the most unusual and deadly was the prohibition against stealing clothing, especially socks. Why socks? Because on a ship surrounded by salt water, where your feet were your livelihood and disease spread through small wounds, a sock was more than fabric. It was armor, it was health, it was morale. But our story doesn't begin in the warm winds of the tropics. It begins in the icy chill of the North Atlantic, on a ship called the Vengeance, in the year 1705. The crew of the Vengeance. The Vengeance was a mid-sized brigantine outfitted for piracy. Not especially fast, not especially new, but captained by a man whose name history barely remembers, Captain Eli Blackstrap Morley. Captain Morley wasn't the sort of man who inspired legends. He wasn't cruel like Blackbeard or flashy like Calico Jack. He was, instead, a deeply practical man. Formerly a sailor for the British East India Company, he'd turned to piracy after a contract dispute and a particularly violent disagreement involving a broken compass and a poorly cooked eel. Morley believed in order, and his ship ran with the precision of a merchant crew despite being full of criminals. The articles of the Vengeance, the pirates' written code, were strict. Theft among the crew was punishable by marooning, mutiny meant death, and stealing another man's socks. That meant the whip. The disappearance. In late October of 1705, just after the crew had taken a small Spanish coastal vessel off Cuba, a problem arose. A deckhand named Jonas Reed reported his only remaining pair of socks missing. At first, it seemed trivial. Men lost things at sea all the time, but Reed insisted he'd placed them under his hammock, as always. And the day after the socks vanished, he developed a painful foot infection that rendered him nearly unable to stand. Soon after, another sailor, Tommy Hatch, began wearing a suspiciously similar pair. But here where the story turns. Instead of confronting Hatch with accusations, Reed did something unexpected. He went to Captain Morley. Morley, for reasons still debated by maritime historians, took the complaint seriously. Perhaps it was because he himself had been a victim of theft years before. Perhaps he simply knew that the fragile equilibrium of pirate democracy depended on small rules, not big ones. He ordered an investigation. The ship's trial. On pirate ships, justice wasn't handed down by a king or admiral. It was voted on by the crew. The quartermaster typically led the investigation, and in this case, that role fell to Matthew Crane, a former schoolteacher turned pirate after being wrongly accused of embezzlement. Crane interviewed everyone. He created a hand-drawn map of sock movements across the lower deck. He timed sailors' shifts, checked laundry ropes, even examined the stitching on the socks in question, all while enduring the mockery of a crew that found the entire affair both hilarious and unnerving. But then Crane discovered something. The socks Tommy Hatch wore were not just similar to Reed's, they were Reed's. A small red thread in the toe, sewn in by Reed's sister back in Liverpool, served as proof. Hatch was guilty. The verdict. The crew assembled on deck. The charges were read aloud: stealing from a crewmate, violating the articles, endangering health. Hatch pleaded for mercy. He claimed it was an accident, that he thought the socks were his. But Crane had already uncovered that Hatch had sold his own pair in Jamaica for a bottle of rum 3 weeks earlier. The vote was cast. Of the 34 crew members, 27 voted for the lash, 7 abstained. And so on that morning, Tommy Hatch was tied to the mast and given 20 lashes, bloody, slow, deliberate. Not for mutiny, not for murder. For socks. The ripples. In the days that followed, a strange calm settled over the Vengeance. The sock rule, once mocked, became sacred. New recruits were informed immediately upon boarding. Don't touch another man's cloth, they were told, especially not his socks. What had started as a small theft had become a psychological anchor. But then 2 months later, something worse happened. The quartermaster, Matthew Crane, vanished. No splash had been heard, no note was found, his hammock untouched, his personal belongings including his socks left behind. Some said he'd fallen overboard. Others whispered that revenge had been taken. And so, on a dark sea under a moonless sky, the story of sock theft turned into something else entirely. A mystery, a murder, or a desertion in shame. We don't know. But we do know this. Piracy, for all its reputation of lawlessness, depended on structure. And sometimes, the smallest crimes, the ones most people laugh at, are the ones that reveal the cracks. Especially when the stakes are your only pair of socks. The disappearance of Quartermaster Matthew Crane was more than unsettling. It was a rupture in the fragile order Captain Eli Morley had so carefully maintained aboard the Vengeance. Aboard any pirate ship, the quartermaster was second only to the captain, often acting as a check on his power. But Crane was more than that. He was respected, methodical, and perhaps most importantly, trusted. And now he was gone. A ghost among the hammocks. The morning after Crane vanished, Captain Morley held a rare full crew assembly on the upper deck. The weather was gray, the wind stalled, and the sea laid flat like oiled leather. It was unnatural, whether sailors called it a dead calm, and many took it as a bad omen. Morley stood at the helm, coat unbuttoned, pipe unlit. He didn't bark orders, he asked questions. When was he last seen? Who stood watch on the night shift? Was there a splash, a struggle, a whisper? The crew murmured among themselves. One said Crane had been seen in the galley just before dusk. Another claimed he'd heard soft footsteps above deck around midnight, but no one had seen him leave the ship, and nothing had been taken. The only clue was this. One of Crane's boots was found lying on the lower deck beneath the mainmast, a faint streak of blood inside. It was not fresh. An inquest at sea. Captain Morley was not a man given to superstition, but the Vengeance was suddenly thick with it. Men spoke in hushed tones. Meals were silent. One sailor began sleeping with a dagger under his pillow, convinced the ship had been cursed since the sock trial. Morley convened an inquest. It was rare for pirates to conduct formal investigations outside of theft or mutiny. But this disappearance was different. It threatened morale. It suggested foul play. And worst of all, it was an unsolved crime aboard a vessel full of criminals. He reappointed the boatswain, Isaac Merle, as acting quartermaster and tasked him with uncovering the truth. Merle, a grizzled Scotsman with little patience for drama, approached the investigation with brute pragmatism. He began by inspecting Crane's sleeping quarters. Nothing appeared disturbed. A half-finished logbook, a wax-sealed letter, and a cloth satchel with 8 silver reals. Nothing missing. Except for one item, his socks. The second sock incident. The fact that Crane's socks were missing might have been brushed off after all. The ship was known for bad laundry habits. But Merle remembered the trial, the precedent, the obsession with socks that had overtaken the crew since Hatch's lashing. He called in Jonas Reed, the original sock theft victim. Reed was still limping slightly from his foot infection, but otherwise recovered. Reed admitted that Crane had taken his sock theft seriously. He thought it wasn't about the cloth, he said, but about the principle, that if a man's dignity can be stolen, even in wool, it can be stolen in gold. Merle asked a simple question: had Crane made enemies? Reed paused. Yes, one. Tommy Hatch. The return of Tommy Hatch. After his punishment, Hatch had been assigned bilge duty, the foulest work on a ship, sloshing through the refuse, the rot, the leaks. His back still bore faint scars from the lashes. He didn't complain, but he didn't forget either. When Muriel confronted him, Hatch was uncooperative. He denied involvement, denied seeing Crane that night, denied even knowing about the missing socks. But Muriel had heard rumors. A few crewmen said Hatch had been seen sharpening his knife late into the evening. One claimed Hatch had muttered something under his breath at mess. No man stays clean in the bilge forever. Still, without proof, Morley refused to punish him again. The crew, still democratic at its core, voted against detaining Hatch. It wasn't enough. Morale sank. Discipline cracked. And then the third incident occurred. A sabotage in the sails. 1 week after Crane's disappearance, just as the Vengeance approached the windward passage, the topgallant sail tore loose in a sudden gust. Muriel, now in charge of ship integrity, climbed the rigging himself to inspect the damage. There, near the pulley hooks, he found a frayed rope deliberately cut. Not worn, not rot. Sabotaged. And tied around the broken rope, a single strip of cloth, narrow and coarse. A sock. The journal in the galley. Faced with rising paranoia, Morley began searching Crane's belongings more thoroughly. Hidden in the bottom of the quartermaster's chest was a second logbook, one not listed in ship records. A personal journal. The entries were cryptic, but several things stood out. A reference to the Whisperer, an unnamed crew member Crane suspected of sowing division. Notations about missing rations, unreported trades during port stops. A single line scrawled 3 days before he vanished. The rot spreads from the bilge, and the bilge walks on 2 legs. Morley showed the journal to no one but Muriel. Together, they began suspecting that Crane's disappearance wasn't about revenge but about something deeper. A conspiracy. Perhaps Hatch wasn't acting alone. Perhaps the theft of socks, the sabotage, the whispering, it was all part of something orchestrated. But orchestrated by whom? The ledger that didn't add up. At this point in the narrative, the story takes a quieter turn. For all the tension, for all the mysterious disappearances and coded phrases, the next clue came not from a confession or a body, but from the ship's financial records. Muriel noticed inconsistencies in the prize division from their last raid. Coin that should have gone to the common fund was marked as unclaimed. A shipment of sugar had been undervalued. 1 chest of silver reels had been logged as damaged and thrown overboard due to water rot. Except there had been no water rot, and no sailor throws silver overboard. Tracing the entries, Muriel found they had all been logged under a crewman's identifier, a scratched symbol that matched the mark used by Quartermaster Crane, or someone pretending to be him. A new suspect. This shifted suspicion entirely. What if Crane hadn't been the victim? What if he had staged his disappearance? Had he falsified records? Had he created the Whisperer as a diversion? Or was he silenced because he discovered the falsified records? Theories began to splinter. Some thought Crane had made off in the night with a boat and gold. Others believed he'd been tossed overboard by conspirators protecting a smuggling ring within the ship. But there was no evidence of mutiny. No empty lifeboat. No blood on deck other than the boot. Only shadows. And socks. The crew's fracture. By early December, the crew had divided into factions: those who believed Crane had been murdered, and those who believed he'd deserted. A few suggested Crane had never existed at all, that he was a ghost created by Morley to scare them into order. Mutiny brewed like storm clouds. Tensions reached a peak when a crew member was found unconscious near the gun deck, struck on the head. No one claimed responsibility. No one saw a thing. In the following days, men began hiding their clothing. Socks were tied to belts, stuffed into boots, tucked into shirts. A strange paranoia took hold. Captain Morley knew what few captains dared admit aloud. He was losing control. And still, there was no resolution. One final entry. At the end of the second logbook, a page had been folded and sealed with wax. Morley broke it open on Christmas Eve, alone in his quarters. It read, "If this book finds hands other than mine, know this. The crew is not what it seems. The crimes on this ship are not born of desperation, but practice. There is theft within the bones of this vessel. I fear not the man with a blade, but the one who smiles at the inventory. MC. No names. No accusations. Just fear. Fear and a warning." When Captain Eli Morley read the final entry in Matthew Crane's private log, the weight of it pressed on him like the sea itself. There is theft within the bones of this vessel. Not theft of socks, not theft of silver, something more corrosive, a rot of intent masked by order. The Vengeance, once an unusually disciplined pirate vessel, was now a slow-moving ship with faster rumors than sails. Men watched each other more than the horizon. Discipline turned to suspicion. Trust essential on a ship where lives depended on coordinated motion fractured into cliques and whispered theory. And yet the ship still sailed, through the windward passage, past unmarked keys, into the Caribbean fog. But something dark still lingered. Something or someone was keeping inventory. The smuggler below deck. It was the youngest crew member, an apprentice sailmaker named Benno Reed, no relation to Jonah's, who found the hidden compartment. Benno had been sent below deck to patch a cracked spar when he noticed a faint draft near the ballast hold. Curious, and by his own account, bored, he tapped on the wooden paneling and found a hollow knock. Inside was a crudely constructed false wall, just large enough to conceal a small chest. He didn't open it. He reported it. For that, he nearly got himself killed. That night, someone tried to push him overboard. The chest. Under guard, Captain Morley and Isaac Merle broke into the hidden chest. Inside, 400 reals in Spanish silver. A ledger written in fine, organized script clearly not Crane's handwriting. A rolled map of trade routes between Nassau and Port-de-Paix. 4 unmatched socks, one with dried blood. A signet ring belonging to Crane. And a list, just a list. No headings, no context, but every name on it matched a current crew member of the Vengeance except 3 who had been presumed lost at sea over the last 5 years. One more name was scratched out. Matthew Crane. The theory becomes a pattern. The ledger revealed a pattern of internal theft, coins skimmed from captured prizes, with fake entries in the official logs to cover discrepancies. This wasn't petty theft. This was systematic embezzlement. Whoever wrote the ledger had been stealing from the crew for years, long before Crane's disappearance. That's when Morley saw the quiet brilliance of the crime. By operating within the ship's own discipline, faking financial entries, inventing reasons for lost cargo, even manipulating laundry rotations, this unknown crew member had created a parasitic command structure. He let the illusion of democracy persist while siphoning from beneath. And anyone who got close disappeared. Just like the others. Just like Crane. The Whisperer unmasked. All signs began to point toward one man. Not Tommy Hatch. Not Merle. But Callum Price, the ship's assistant purser. Price was invisible, a numbers man, small, pale, with a permanent ink stain on his thumb. He kept to himself, recorded supplies, updated the ship's log. He had no enemies, no close friends. He'd never been on deck during a fight, never drunk too much, never broke a rule. Too perfect. And that was the problem. When confronted by Morley and Merle, Price did not protest. He simply looked at the chest and said, "You shouldn't have found that." His tone was not angry. It was tired. The truth comes loose. In the hours that followed, Price confessed in bits and pieces, not out of guilt, but out of something stranger: relief. He had been embezzling from the ship's crew for at least 6 voyages, using a method he called ghost waiting. For every haul, he would slightly underreport values or claim items were damaged or unsellable, moving the difference into a personal stash hidden in hollowed compartments around the ship. The socks, they were part of his method. Price noted how few men tracked their clothing except Crane. When Crane began tracking sock rotation and laundry times to solve the first theft, Price panicked. The sock code had been intended as discipline, but for Price, it had become a threat. Crane had gotten too close. So Price forged the final ledger entry in Crane's name, then arranged for his disappearance. He didn't admit to murder, only that Crane had left unwillingly. But he didn't act alone. Price had a silent partner, someone who helped misdirect, confuse, and sabotage. Tommy Hatch. Justice pirate style. The crew was given the full account: evidence, ledger, confession, and motive. The vote was called. In pirate society, democracy was sacred until the rules were broken beyond repair. For Price, the sentence was marooning, a small island near the Key Sal Bank, a musket with a single shot, a flask of water, a single sock. Tommy Hatch was not so lucky. The crew, still remembering the whip scars and the internal sabotage, voted 29-2 for execution. It was carried out swiftly. Captain Morley, despite the procedural clarity, aged visibly in the days that followed. The cost of order. The Vengeance continued sailing for another 3 years, though it never recovered its former discipline. The sock rule remained, but more as a superstition than a code. Captain Morley resigned his post in 1710 and reportedly settled in Tortuga under an assumed name. He never captained again. As for the legacy of Crane, his mysterious disappearance and methodical habits became a quiet legend among pirate crews. Some vessels began recording sock rotations in honor of him, others as a joke. But many captains noted that theft declined where Crane's code was enforced. To this day, some maritime historians consider it the earliest form of internal ship auditing, using mundane details to detect deeper corruption. And what of the socks? One of them, a faded woolen piece with red thread at the toe, now sits in a maritime museum in Bermuda, labeled simply, "Evidence of a ship undone by discipline." Reflection. In the end, the Vengeance wasn't torn apart by mutiny or cannon fire. It was undone by a kind of rot more insidious than open rebellion, quiet betrayal inside an orderly system. The lesson of Crane, Price, and Hatch isn't about socks. It's about how trust and order, once violated, don't collapse with noise but with silence. A bookkeeper, a whisper, a ledger entry adjusted by half a coin. That's what breaks a crew. That's what sinks a ship. In the summer of 1984, the town of Raven Hill, New Hampshire, was as ordinary as they come. Nestled between 2 highways, no one remembered building, and home to fewer than 2,000 people, it was a place where little ever happened. Except that in August, the mail stopped coming. At first, it seemed like a blip in the system, maybe a delay, maybe a new route driver, but then entire households noticed. No bills, no birthday cards, no catalogs. And when someone called the post office to ask why they hadn't received a check from their cousin in Ohio, they were told something strange. "We already delivered that." They hadn't. Over the next 4 months, nearly $90,000 in checks, government notices, refund claims, and private mail went missing without a single recorded break-in. This wasn't a robbery. This was a slow, meticulous disappearance. And at the center of it stood Harold Dempsey, the town's postmaster. The most trusted man in town. Harold Dempsey had worked for the Raven Hill Post Office for 26 years. He was tall, pleasant, always wore neatly ironed shirts, and smelled faintly of cedar and envelope glue. He lived 3 blocks from the post office, walked to work even in snowstorms, and knew everyone's dog by name. No one wanted to suspect Harold, but over time, facts whispered louder than comfort. The problem wasn't theft from the outside. There were no signs of forced entry, no missing key cards, no torn envelopes dumped in a ditch. The problem was inside the system. And the more inspectors looked, the more they realized the system wasn't broken. It was being used exactly as designed. A town of delayed deliveries. Residents of Raven Hill began filing complaints in increasing numbers. But what drew the attention of the United States Postal Inspection Service, USPIS, wasn't the mail delay. It was the patterns. An IRS refund check went missing, but was later deposited at a bank in a neighboring county using a forged signature. A Social Security notice never arrived, and the recipient failed to file a response, losing benefits for 6 months. A box containing vintage baseball cards insured and tracked was marked as delivered, but the recipient never saw it. Instead, the signature on the delivery form read H. Dempsey. That's when the local police made their first quiet call to federal authorities. The investigators arrived quietly. In November 1984, 2 postal inspectors arrived under the pretense of conducting a routine audit. They were not wearing badges. They were not accompanied by agents. They asked polite questions and took extensive notes. Harold Dempsey answered everything with the gentle confusion of a man too kind to be lying, but too rehearsed to be trusted. He blamed sorting errors. He mentioned budget cuts. He even suggested maybe one of the new hires was confused by the rural routing. But one inspector noticed something odd. The back room of the post office was locked, and Harold insisted he had misplaced the key. The inspectors returned with a court order 3 days later. Behind the locked door. Inside the locked room, investigators found what they later described as a miniature mail hoarder's vault. Bundles of undelivered mail, some postmarked as far back as 1982, open packages, torn envelopes, filing cabinets filled with canceled checks, cash-filled birthday cards, stamps soaked off envelopes and resold, a full ledger labeled backroom filings. The ledger detailed incoming and outgoing mail, categorized by estimated usefulness. Column headers read, cash/checks, high-value correspondence, renewables, magazine subscription rebates, discarded junk. This wasn't mismanagement. It was orchestrated theft. How to steal a post office. What Harold Dempsey had done was uniquely simple. He hadn't broken into anything. He hadn't even hacked a system. He was the system. He would collect mail from the main depot, sort the low-value items, normally ads, magazines, town circulars, siphon off higher-value correspondence, anything with money, IDs, or checks. Mark some of these items as delivered using forged signatures. Stash them in the back room. Skim the cash, copy checks, sell information. Sometimes he waited weeks before moving items. Other times, he would reseal envelopes and forward them after skimming. It wasn't just greed, it was control. Harold had, in effect, stolen the very function of the post office. And no one had noticed for over 2 years. A gentle thief. In interviews with townspeople after the investigation broke, few could reconcile the man they knew with the crimes he committed. He gave my son a ride to school when the bus broke down, one woman said. He used to set out water bowls for dogs in summer, another added. Even the investigating agent struggled. He was polite. He offered us coffee. He joked about how mail used to be more romantic, one said. But the ledger didn't lie. Nor did the $74,000 in illicit funds traced to multiple bank accounts under Harold's name and aliases. nor the 192 rare stamp sheets, many of which had been reported missing from mail between 1981 and 1984. When the system covers itself. What made this crime truly difficult to trace wasn't the scale, it was the structure. Post offices in small towns often rely on singular authority figures. They are gatekeepers of federal systems but operate in places with no oversight, no cameras, no redundancy. Harold had become a one-man institution, a gate that, when closed, trapped the very people it was meant to serve. And he'd done it quietly, slowly, without a gun or mask. It took over 9 months of forensic auditing, victim interviews, and deposit tracing to fully understand the scope of the theft. Much of the damage, missed opportunities, lost benefits, and broken timelines could never be fully repaired. The arrest. Harold Dempsey was arrested on February 6, 1985. He was sitting on the post office steps, sipping coffee from a thermos when the inspectors returned. When asked if he had anything to say, he reportedly smiled and replied, "I suppose you're here for the mail." An open question. Before sentencing, Harold gave a brief, voluntary statement in court. In it, he admitted guilt but claimed the real problem was the system that allowed him to operate unchecked. The post office isn't a building, it's a blind spot, and if you sit in it long enough, you realize people trust it more than they should. I didn't rob them, I just held their mail a little too long. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and served 5 before being released to a halfway house in Maine. To this day, no one knows where most of the cash ended up. Many suspect he had an accomplice. Some wonder if there were other postmasters doing the same thing quietly, carefully, in the forgotten towns where trust is currency and mail is law. When Harold Dempsey was led out of the Raven Hill post office in handcuffs, there was no outrage, just a stunned, aching silence. For weeks, people came by to stare at the building like it had become a crime scene, which, technically, it had. The headlines called him the gentle postman, but the deeper investigators looked, the less gentle it all became. Harold hadn't simply committed theft. He had created a parallel bureaucracy within a federal agency, his own private network of mail, value, and misdirection. And for the team tasked with uncovering how deep the fraud went, the story was just beginning. A timeline of trust erosion. Between 1982 and 1984, Harold Dempsey handled approximately 1.6 million pieces of mail. That figure sounds massive, but for a rural region that serviced multiple counties, it was average. What wasn't average were the discrepancies. The USPIS team, now working with the FBI's white-collar crime division, began the long and grueling process of reconstructing Dempsey's trail through bank records, ledger books, and the unassuming bundles of stolen mail still tied in twine in the back room. Each piece of evidence told part of the story. March 3, 1983. A $2,800 check from a real estate escrow agency disappeared. It was endorsed and deposited using a forged signature traced back to Dempsey's handwriting. July 29, 1984. 23 envelopes containing cash wedding gifts were never delivered to a couple in Windham. 9 of those envelopes were found opened and resealed in Dempsey's locked cabinet. November 12, 1984. A subscription mailer for a retirement annuity service was altered. Dempsey had replaced the address of a senior citizen with a P.O. box registered under a false name. He cashed the rebate. Over time, the pattern became impossible to deny. Harold had created a secondary post office that served no one but himself. Operation Letterfall, the internal audit. The audit team named the investigation Operation Letterfall, a sardonic reference to how the entire scheme unraveled not with a bang, but a slowly collapsing pile of misplaced letters. Agents began comparing Dempsey's handwritten logs to the official USPS dispatch system, an internal digital network that tracked high-value mail, checks, parcels, and government documents. But here was the problem. In 1982, rural post offices were still using paper dispatch logs. Dempsey exploited this gap mercilessly. He would mark certain mail as non-delivery returned to sender. Never return it. Instead, intercept it and route it to a different P.O. box, often one of his own. He had 6 active P.O. boxes, each registered under slight variations of his name. H. Dempsey, H.L. Dempsey, Hal Dempsey, and so on. All were paid in cash. That's when agents realized this was more than embezzlement. It was identity fraud. A stolen identity web. Within 3 weeks of opening the investigation to outside databases, the FBI found 21 instances where Harold had used stolen mail too. Open credit cards. Apply for consumer rebates. Register for subscription sweepstakes. Redirect Social Security payments. He had never gone big, never bought a car, never purchased property, but he had mastered a quiet, sustained siphoning of financial identity. This wasn't greed in the typical sense. Harold didn't live extravagantly. His home was modest. His wardrobe never changed. His car was a 1977 Buick with peeling paint. But inside that house, investigators discovered meticulous records binders, categorized by address and name, detailing which residents had incoming checks, which banks they used, and how frequently they received valuable mail. Raven Hill reacts. As the truth came out, a strange thing happened in Raven Hill. Sympathy fractured. Some still defended Harold, claiming the system had overworked and underpaid him. Others were furious, especially those who lost money, missed IRS filings, or had their identities used to open false accounts. But no one could deny the elegance of what Harold had done. He hadn't robbed a vault. He hadn't hacked a system. He had simply used the rhythm of trust against the people who had given it. He didn't break the rules, one resident said. He rewrote them. Hidden correspondence. One of the stranger discoveries came from a locked drawer in Harold's living room desk. Inside were hundreds of personal letters he had never mailed. Some were to childhood friends. Others were drafts of apology to residents whose mail he'd stolen. One never signed read, "I hold these envelopes like they're secrets, and I'm the only one who knows how much they weigh. People think stamps are about value, but they're about movement, and I stop things from moving." Some investigators believed Harold may have suffered from a mild form of obsessive-compulsive disorder, triggered by grief or isolation. Others thought he simply enjoyed the power of withholding communication, of becoming a gatekeeper in a world built on delivery. A quiet form of control. The system that enabled him. What stung most wasn't just what Harold had done, but how easy it had been. The USPS was and remains a sprawling bureaucracy. In the 1980s, small-town post offices like Raven Hills were often exempt from serious oversight due to trust tenure clauses, which granted postmasters near-complete control over routing and logging mail. Harold was both the first and final word in mail processing. No audits had been done for 6 years. No anonymous complaint system existed. The entire chain of custody relied on assumed integrity. Investigators later testified before Congress that had the town's post office received just one random audit, the fraud would have been caught within weeks. Instead, it lasted at least 30 months. The last letter. Before sentencing, Harold asked if he could write a final letter to the town. Surprisingly, the court allowed it on the condition it be reviewed and approved. He wrote, "To Raven Hill, I'm sorry for every birthday missed, every check lost, every call not answered because the letter never came. I wanted to be part of the system, not above it, but I learned how quiet power can be. You trusted me. I became the mailbox and the lock. Forgive me if you can. I couldn't stop myself from watching everything pass through my hands. HD. The letter was never delivered. Some say the court withheld it. Others say the judge, upon reading it, sealed it in the courthouse archive. But what no one denies is that Harold Dempsey had created a crime so subtle, so ordinary, that it took years to notice. And once it was noticed, it couldn't be unseen. By early 1986, Harold Dempsey's case had become a kind of bureaucratic ghost story. Not because of how much money he stole, though $90,000 in small-town mail fraud was substantial. Not even because he acted alone, exploiting a sleepy postal system. But because of what happened after. Once Dempsey was behind bars, and the town's post office placed under federal management, the mail still didn't arrive like it used to. Letters still went missing. Checks were delayed. Packages were misrouted. At first, investigators assumed it was damage from Dempsey's scheme's old habits, broken protocols. But then someone noticed something disturbing in the records. Dempsey's system was still operating, a circuit that outlived its creator. In the winter of 1986, a new postmaster was installed in Raven Hill, a former logistics officer named Geneva Carter. She was meticulous, sharp, and known for fixing messy routes in broken rural districts. Within a month, Carter submitted her first internal report. Undelivered mail volumes remain inconsistent with scanned dispatches. Interference suspected in outgoing sortation. In plain terms, mail marked as sent never reached its destinations, even though tracking data claimed it had. Forensics teams returned to Raven Hill, this time under the directive of the Office of the Inspector General. They re-examined Harold's original setup. What they found shocked them. Some of Dempsey's forged systems had become automated. The shadow of legacy code. During his tenure, Harold had begun experimenting with a limited-use computerized routing program designed for larger post offices. Installed quietly in 1983, it was intended to streamline rural post operations by digitizing portions of the dispatch log and creating labeling shortcuts. But Harold used it differently. He created phantom addresses, non-existent PO boxes, and residential entries that acted as mail sinks. When triggered, they rerouted parcels into internal return bins, where they were never reprocessed. It was efficient. It was clean. And nobody knew how to shut it down. After Dempsey's arrest, the patchwork system remained live, redirecting certain pieces of mail based on his pre-coded flags. The machine didn't know he was gone. It kept protecting the wrong addresses. The black hole bins. In a 1987 audit, federal inspectors coined a nickname for the malfunctioning internal trays: black hole bins. They appeared like ordinary sorting boxes, but mail deposited there often by accident was never re-entered into circulation. An internal analysis revealed at least 3,400 letters lost to these bins in a 16-month period after Dempsey's arrest. One former inspector described the discovery in his memoir. It was like finding a haunted filing cabinet. You'd pull it open and out would fall birthday cards from 2 years ago, tax forms no one had filed, jury summonses unmailed. It was as if time had paused inside those drawers. Raven Hill was still bleeding from wounds it didn't know were open. The real cost of the crime. The financial damage was significant. In total, over $128,000 in verifiable losses were attributed to Dempsey's scheme between cash, checks, and identity fraud. But the unquantifiable losses were worse. Credit scores destroyed. Citizens fined for missed legal deadlines. Pension enrollments voided. Family disputes over mail that never arrived. One elderly woman missed an inheritance deadline and lost $15,000 due to a will notification that sat in the backroom bin for 19 months. Another man missed his father's funeral after a letter informing him of the date was routed into one of Dempsey's phantom addresses. This was not a simple crime of greed. It was a sustained, corrosive erosion of the most basic civic function, communication. After the system died, it took nearly 2 years and a complete software overhaul to fully remove the phantom routing logic Dempsey had embedded in Raven Hill's operations. In 1988, the town received funding for a completely new facility, with digitized logs, barcode tracking, and camera-monitored sorting stations. They never used Harold Dempsey's desk again. Geneva Carter later testified before a congressional subcommittee on postal fraud, stating, "His crime wasn't just mail theft. He built a second post office inside the first, invisible, functional, and it kept working even after we locked him up." Where did the money go? Despite the confession and the evidence, nearly $42,000 of the stolen funds were never recovered. Harold maintained that he spent most of it on little things and never had a partner. But agents found a safety deposit box in Vermont under the name David Harold, a reverse of his first and middle names. Inside were 2 cashier's checks totaling $16,000, a pristine 1920s Swiss stamp collection worth nearly $5,000, and inexplicably 5 bundles of unsent letters addressed to various residents of Raven Hill. They were personal letters, dated between 1983 and 1984. Some were happy, some were heartbreaking. One was a wedding RSVP with an apology for missing the big day. When asked why he had kept those particular ones, Harold, by then in prison, only shrugged. They felt too heavy to throw away. Aftermath and reflection. When Harold was released from the halfway house in 1991, he vanished into obscurity. He was last reported living in a rented trailer near Claremont, New Hampshire. No further fraud was linked to him. But his legacy changed things. The Harold Dempsey case became required reading in USPIS fraud prevention training. It triggered reforms in rural post auditing, routing digitization, and the creation of whistleblower policies within isolated branches. In Raven Hill, the post office stands renovated and sleek, but some residents still joke that if a letter goes missing, Harold must have wanted to read it first. Final thought. In the end, Harold Dempsey didn't rob a vault. He didn't break into a system. He didn't even leave town. He became the system. And then he bent it slowly, quietly, with a ledger book and a pen until it served him alone. The most dangerous crimes often aren't the loudest. They're the ones we trust enough never to question. At precisely 3:17 p.m. on March 8, 1997, a red light blinked on in the backroom of a Henderson's General Pharmacy in rural Iowa. The security light wasn't connected to any advanced surveillance grid or alarm system. It simply indicated that someone had opened a secured supply cabinet. Normally, this light blinked several times a day, but on this particular Saturday, the cabinet had been opened 14 times in the span of 2 hours, and each time, only one item was recorded missing. A toothbrush. Retail value, $1.99. Harmless, forgettable, probably a stocking error. Except it kept happening. Over the next 6 weeks, over 240 toothbrushes disappeared from Henderson's. No break-ins, no camera footage, no register discrepancies. Just toothbrushes, and one increasingly suspicious manager named Colleen Garrett, who refused to accept the explanation that someone must just really like dental hygiene. What she uncovered was a case so strange, so deliberate, and so unnecessary, it became the cornerstone of modern retail fraud training. This was not a case about stealing toothbrushes. It was a case about stealing patterns. A store too quiet for crime. Henderson's General Pharmacy was the kind of place that only sold what you needed. No widescreen TVs, no high-end gadgets, toothpaste, thermometers, bandages, and maybe a single shelf of dusty romance paperbacks. Colleen Garrett had worked there for 17 years. She wasn't glamorous, but she was precise. She knew the value of every item by memory. She had once calculated the entire monthly supply budget with a yellow notepad and a coffee stirrer as a straightedge. So when she noticed the toothbrush stock depleting at unusual rates, her instinct wasn't panic, it was math. A store that sold 5 toothbrushes a day shouldn't be ordering new ones every 3 days. Her staff didn't believe her. So she did what she always did. She made a spreadsheet. And that spreadsheet would later become evidence in a federal case. The first pattern. At first, Colleen thought it was shoplifting. Maybe a teenager with poor impulse control. Maybe someone building an art project made entirely out of dental supplies. But the security camera footage, what little existed, showed nothing. No one stuffing pockets. No unscanned merchandise walking out the door. Just the usual flow of tired customers buying cold medicine and cough drops. Then she noticed something peculiar in the register logs. A single employee, Ronnie Eastman, a part-time clerk, was often present during the shifts when toothbrushes went missing. Not always, but often. Colleen didn't want to believe it. Ronnie was polite, soft-spoken. He had a wife and newborn at home. He always wore a lanyard that said, "Smile, it's contagious." But the numbers didn't lie. So she started watching. Ronnie's system, Ronnie's scam, if you could call it that, was deceptively simple. He would scan a toothbrush twice at checkout, then void the second scan. He'd then remove one of the toothbrushes from the shelf inventory manually and keep it. Because the voided scan wasn't linked to a sale, the system assumed the brush had been scanned and discarded. Ronnie never left the store with them. He placed them in a supply bin under the register marked "Damaged Returns." Once a week, Ronnie took the bin to the back room for returns processing. But the returns were never filed. Instead, he'd rebox the toothbrushes, sometimes cleaned, sometimes not, and sell them through a classifieds newsletter in the next county over. Price per brush, $1.25. Why toothbrushes? When later asked by investigators why he chose toothbrushes, Ronnie gave an answer so mundane it was surreal. "They're light, nobody checks them, you can fit 10 in your jacket and everyone needs one." It wasn't greed. Ronnie never stole money from the till. He never tampered with narcotics or expensive electronics. He was committing fraud quietly on the item, least likely to draw attention. Until Colleen began logging everything. The spreadsheet that broke the case. Colleen's spreadsheet tracked every toothbrush purchase, incoming shipment, recorded damage report, voided sale, employee on shift. After 6 weeks, the pattern emerged. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, toothbrushes would vanish. The same voids appeared, the same employee, the same shipment numbers used in the return forms. Colleen brought it to the store owner. The owner brought it to law enforcement. And law enforcement brought it to the Iowa Department of Revenue, who realized something bigger. Ronnie hadn't just stolen toothbrushes. He had created a tax-free, unlicensed dental supply resale business, using stolen inventory from at least 3 different general stores. And he'd been doing it for nearly 3 years. The bigger picture. It turns out Henderson's wasn't the first store. Ronnie had worked at a convenience store in Mason City and another pharmacy in Des Moines. Both had reported minor but persistent toothbrush inventory issues. Neither investigated. When police searched Ronnie's home, they found 16 boxes of unopened toothbrushes, 2 large manila folders of classified ad receipts. A handwritten list titled, Hot Sellers Dental. Among the items, electric toothbrush heads, kids' character-themed brushes, bulk soft bristle packs. Ronnie had even created a fake business name, Gentlemouth Supplies, and used a P.O. box to process mail orders. He had made just over $4,300 in profit since 1994. It was the most tedious, small-scale fencing operation the state had ever seen. But it was still a crime, a legal oddity. Ronnie was charged with petty theft, misuse of retail systems, and operating an unlicensed business. None of the toothbrushes were valued high enough for felony charges on their own, but cumulatively, the case could be argued as organized retail fraud. The prosecutors pushed for a creative approach. Instead of pursuing jail time, they proposed a symbolic sentencing. Ronnie was required to complete 1,000 hours of community service, mostly with dental outreach programs for children. He was barred from working retail or handling inventory systems for 5 years. He had to repay the stores at a rate of $50 a month. He did all of it. In fact, he later became a volunteer coordinator for a nonprofit dental van service across 3 counties. Some say he genuinely turned his life around. Reflection. In court, Ronnie was asked what he'd learned. His answer: that people stop looking when the item is cheap, but cheap doesn't mean invisible. Final thought. The toothbrush heist of 1997 didn't involve violence, or weapons, or daring escapes. It involved a man, a register, and a blind spot no one thought to check. And that's the lesson. Crimes don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes, they hide in plain sight right next to the toothpaste. By the time Ronnie Eastman was facing community service instead of prison time, investigators weren't calling him a thief in the traditional sense. They were calling him something far more unsettling: an accidental systems engineer. Because what Ronnie had built wasn't just a scam. It was a low-cost, low-risk, high-redundancy economic engine, one that took full advantage of small retail blind spots, weak inventory systems, and human indifference. This section follows how Ronnie's operation evolved from a lonely act of petty fraud into a systematized theft model, and why, years later, big-box stores still train employees using the Ronnie principle. The Gentlemouth business model. To understand how Ronnie's low-level scheme operated for nearly 3 years, you need to understand how nobody noticed it. Because Ronnie's genius wasn't in theft, it was in blending in. His scam was designed not to scale up, but to stay small enough to be boring. And in a world obsessed with catching big crimes, that's how it worked. The core loop. Select target products. Ronnie chose items with the following characteristics: lightweight, low retail value, under $5, easy to scan and void without triggering suspicion, not tied to security tags or serial tracking. Exploit the void function. Most small retail point-of-sale (POS) systems allow employees to void an item before a transaction is finalized. These voids often go unmonitored unless part of a suspicious pattern. Ronnie would scan a toothbrush once, counts as inventory out. Void the second scan, register reads it as removed. Physically remove both, but report one as defective. Damaged box smuggling. Using a box labeled damaged goods, Ronnie would store toothbrushes under the counter during his shifts. Once or twice a week, he would take out the trash or walk them to the back office for inventory returns. Resale via classifieds and flea markets. He sold brushes at $25 one, $50 a piece, under the name Gentlemouth Supplies. His buyers were often daycare centers, mobile dental clinics, budget-conscious parents, Other small retailers looking for discount stock. No storefront, no paper trail, only local classifieds, flea market tables, and occasional word-of-mouth orders through rural church newsletters. The inventory gap. How could this happen in a world of barcodes, scanners, and digital ledgers? Because those systems weren't universal in the mid-90s, especially not in small-town chain stores. At Henderson's and the other locations Ronnie worked, inventory was logged weekly, not daily. Products under $5 were not individually reconciled. Damaged goods reports were often discarded after 30 days. No one expected toothbrushes to be stolen en masse. Ronnie's scam was based on a principle he once joked about to his coworkers. Steal $500, you're a crook. Steal $5 100 times, you're a cashier. The human blind spot. What Ronnie had really done was exploit something deeper than inventory software: trust in repetition. Employees scan hundreds of items a day. A toothbrush is the epitome of routine. It's not exciting. It doesn't raise red flags. When Colleen Garrett's spreadsheet exposed Ronnie, corporate investigators were stunned not because of the crime's scale, but because of its deliberate invisibility. They coined a phrase during the internal review: microtheft camouflage. And Ronnie was its poster child. The other stores. As investigators pulled employment records, they found that Ronnie had worked briefly at two other general stores, one in Mason City, the other in Des Moines. Each time, he had left voluntarily after about 8–10 months. Each time, internal inventory reviews showed toothbrush shortages ranging from 40 to 70 brushes per month, just enough to be written off as error or petty shoplifting. When questioned, Ronnie claimed he left each job for personal reasons, and no employer ever filed theft charges. One even gave him a glowing reference: a pattern of gentle theft. Ronnie's home told a larger story. In his basement were 3 folding tables with labeled boxes, a manual label maker, ledger books tracking toothbrush models by bristle type, a rubber stamp marked "Paid Gentlemouth." He had sold over 3,200 toothbrushes across 3 counties. That amounted to roughly $4,300 in unreported cash income. He filed no taxes for Gentlemouth, didn't even use a business license. But he wasn't hiding because no one had ever come looking. In his mind, Ronnie wasn't stealing. He was reallocating underappreciated dental tools. The turning point: moral gray areas. At sentencing, Ronnie's lawyer argued that the crime was economically insignificant and posed no material harm to the businesses. But the judge countered with a sharper view. This case is not about toothbrushes. It's about systems trust. It's about how one person in a position of low authority can erode that trust not with a heist, but with a habit. The court refused to jail Ronnie, but imposed visible consequences. His 1,000 hours of service would be public. He would work for local dental awareness clinics, school programs on health hygiene, logistics nonprofits that deliver toothbrushes and paste to shelters. His tasks included inventory, but under supervision. Ronnie accepted the sentence with no objection. He reportedly told one official, "I'll never look at soft bristles the same way again." The Ronnie Principle. In 2001, a national pharmacy chain added a case study titled The Ronnie Principle to its employee training manuals. It focused on monitoring void transactions, limiting employee access to damage reports, requiring manager approvals for low-value, high-volume items, psychological patterns behind invisible theft. The case was taught not because of its damage, but because of its teachable complexity. How the smallest crimes, done often enough, become operational threats. Reflection. When you think of crime, you probably imagine a gun, a getaway car, or a backroom full of cash. But sometimes, the most effective crime wears a name tag and offers to help you find the toothpaste aisle. Ronnie didn't break the law all at once. He broke it in $1.99 increments, just slow enough for the world to not notice. Until Colleen Garrett picked up a pencil. Ronnie Eastman never considered himself a criminal. He didn't think he was hurting anyone. And maybe in his mind he was. He didn't lie, didn't manipulate anyone directly, didn't threaten or force. He showed up to work, smiled at customers, balanced the drawer to the cent. And then during a slow hour on a Tuesday or Thursday, he voided a toothbrush scan, slipped it into a bin, and kept the machine moving. But the question investigators kept asking wasn't just how he did it. It was why. The psychological profile. In the months following Ronnie's sentencing, a behavioral economist at the University of Iowa published a paper titled "The Inventory Illusion: Cognitive Dissonance in Low-Impact Theft." It focused heavily on the Eastman case, citing it as one of the clearest examples of compartmentalized ethical reasoning in modern retail crime. Ronnie's profile, as constructed by investigators and later behavioral analysts, suggested that he did not exhibit traditional criminal intent, had no known history of theft or deceit, genuinely believed he was redirecting neglected goods, showed signs of justification stacking, the ability to build tiny, rational explanations to excuse unethical behavior over time. What started as a one-time test, theft became a repeated habit. That habit became routine. And routine, unchecked, became business. Gentle mouth, the final inventory. In the final forensic review of Ronnie's gentle mouth operation, investigators discovered a few last oddities. Customer lists. Ronnie had handwritten lists of loyal buyers complete with notes like soft bristles only or prefers blue handles. Mail orders. He had begun exploring low-cost mail-order options through local classified publications. There were early drafts of brochures advertising overstocked dental supplies for homes, shelters, and clinics. Ethical statements. In one journal he had written the phrase, "They throw away more than they sell. I rescue them." Despite his lack of formal education in business or logistics, Ronnie had built a microenterprise that obeyed all the trappings of ethical commerce, except for the origin of the goods. The Colleen Clause. In the wake of the scandal, Henderson's General Pharmacy implemented new protocols, many inspired directly by Colleen Garrett's work. The company added what it now calls the Colleen Clause into its regional training programs. Any employee can file a data discrepancy report. Minor items like toothbrushes, lip balm, etc. must now be inventory tracked monthly instead of quarterly. All damage bins are now locked and require managerial sign-off. Void transaction reports are reviewed weekly, not quarterly. Colleen herself received recognition from the company's regional manager, including a small bonus and a plaque. But her reaction was famously understated. It wasn't about the toothbrushes, it was about the principle that even boring numbers tell stories, you just have to listen. Ronnie's return. 5 years after his sentencing, Ronnie returned to the public eye in an unexpected way. He gave a quiet interview to a local paper after completing his final volunteer hours. In it, he described how he now worked full-time for a regional logistics company, ironically, helping manage overstock supply distribution. He said the following: "It wasn't about money. It was about doing something that worked. There's something calming about a system that runs until someone notices it's broken." When asked if he regretted it, he paused and said, "I regret not stopping, but I don't regret building it." A toothbrush reconsidered. The final tally. 3,248 toothbrushes stolen. Estimated loss to 3 stores, $6,800. Estimated resale profit, $4,300. Time served, 0 days in jail. Hours served, 1,000. Trust lost, difficult to measure. But the impact remains. Retail companies now use the Eastman model as a case study in micro-theft auditing. It's taught in security seminars and logistics webinars alike. Because the true cost of crime isn't always in the value of what's taken. Sometimes it's in the trust that slowly erodes between employee and employer, system and user, aisle and customer. Final reflection. Ronnie Eastman didn't carry a weapon. He didn't run from the law. He didn't crack safes or wear a mask. He just didn't stop. And maybe that's the scariest kind of crime, the kind that hides behind repetition, behind routine, behind register tape and a smile. It's the kind that doesn't feel like a crime at all. Until you check the inventory. In the mid-1970s, the quiet town of Danbridge, Indiana, was best known for 2 things: the annual Dandelion Festival and a library that hadn't updated its carpet since the Eisenhower administration. Population, 4,119. Crime rate, negligible. Ambition, comfortably low. Until one spring, the town's entire historical record vanished. Newspaper archives, council meeting minutes, tax records, town founding documents gone. Vanished from filing cabinets, shelves, and microfilm drawers. The town historian called it a minor inconvenience. The mayor called it bureaucratic carelessness. But only one person seemed alarmed enough to investigate: a grad student named Melissa Grain, who'd come to Danbridge to research rural newspaper editorial patterns for her thesis. She was supposed to stay for a weekend. She stayed for 6 months. And what she discovered was not a data error. It was a crime. And the culprit wasn't a hacker, a vandal, or a thief with a truck. It was a retired librarian with a label maker. An archive that went quiet. Melissa arrived in Danbridge on April 17, 1976. She planned to spend her weekend scanning back issues of the Danbridge Sentinel, hopping to map patterns of political bias in local reporting between 1930 and 1950. But when she requested the microfilm, the librarian on duty gave her a strange answer. Those reels were pulled for relabeling, should be back next week. Odd but not suspicious. Melissa requested access to physical bound copies instead. But those were missing too. The trail of temporarily unavailable. Over the next 2 days, Melissa compiled a list of public records that should have been stored in the town's combined municipal library building. Newspaper archives, 1930-1960. Town hall minutes, 1930 to 1944. Zoning documents, 1928-1955. Census rolls for 1930 and 1940. Old tax ledgers and property deeds. All had been marked in various file drawers and card catalogs as temporarily removed for processing, or in transit to state archive pending digitization. But when Melissa called the Indiana State Archive to confirm, the archivist told her they hadn't received anything from Danbridge in over a decade. Something didn't add up. The fingerprint of a ghost. Curious and persistent, Melissa requested access to the back room where archives were processed. She was told that room was restricted to authorized personnel only. She waited. When the day librarian left for lunch, Melissa quietly slipped into the room. Inside, she found 2 filing cabinets completely empty, stacks of shredded papers in a bin, and a microfilm scanner still warm from recent use. One detail stood out. On the edge of a storage bin was a fresh label, printed in small black font on white tape. Deaccession 1956B. Melissa had seen that label before in another drawer marked for withdrawal. Someone was deaccessioning the town's memory, not just hiding records, erasing them. Who was doing this? Danbridge Library had one full-time librarian and a handful of part-time aides. But in a photo from the 1950s she found tucked behind a forgotten shelf of Reader's Digests, Melissa saw a name that kept reappearing in the withdrawn file notes. A Marjorie Klein, chief librarian, 1933–1971. She had retired 5 years earlier. But people in town still talked about her. She never let anyone touch the archives, said one clerk. She labeled everything twice, another laughed. Still comes in on Thursdays, asks for shelf space. A retired librarian. Still visiting. Still organizing. Still labeling. Melissa had a name, now she needed a reason. Marjorie Klein, the keeper of truth and lies. Born in 1906, Marjorie Klein had served as Danbridge's head librarian for nearly 40 years. Known for her steel gray bun and refusal to accept paperbacks into the collection, Marjorie was the gatekeeper of everything the town once was. And she had a secret. Over those decades, she had kept a second catalog, a handwritten record of all documents, articles, and archives she personally considered unreliable, unverified, or slanderous. She marked these with a simple code in the margins. RECAT, short for recatalog or remove. According to notes Melissa later recovered, Klein had begun this effort in 1937 after a local newspaper article accused her father, a former councilman, of nepotism in a public works project. The article, later proven true, was never seen again. Neither were the public complaints that followed. The erasure. Klein's philosophy was simple. If information destabilized community trust, it didn't belong in public memory. Over 40 years, she quietly removed articles critical of town leadership, financial records showing budget misuse, letters to the editor from troublemakers, public complaints, entire meeting transcripts from contentious session. In place of erasure, she refiled summarized minutes she typed herself, omitting anything she deemed petty. No one checked. No one questioned. And when the archive transferred to a semi-digital system in the 1970s, she offered to help organize it. That's when the final purge began. Melissa finds the cache. Melissa discovered a sealed crawlspace behind the boiler room after befriending a janitor. Inside were 9 boxes, yellowed, dusty, unmarked. Inside, original copies of the Danbridge Sentinel from 1931 to 1962. Letters to the mayor dating back to the Depression. Accusations of racial discrimination in 1955, zoning laws. A 1942 report showing town funds misused during wartime rationing. All marked RECAT. All filed away by Marjorie Klein. Melissa had proof, a paper trail, motive, and method. But Klein was now in her 70s, retired, frail, and beloved by the community. Would anyone believe she had spent decades curating truth into irrelevance? An unanswered question. When Melissa finally confronted Klein at her home, an aging bungalow filled with notebooks and newspaper clippings, Marjorie didn't deny it. She just smiled and said, "There's more power in subtraction than addition, dear." Melissa pressed her, "Why hide records?" Klein offered a final answer. History is a mosaic, but not everyone deserves a tile. When graduate researcher Melissa Grain walked out of Marjorie Klein's modest bungalow, she wasn't holding a confession. She didn't need one. What she held were 9 boxes of records that proved beyond doubt that Klein had spent over 4 decades quietly reconstructing reality, one withdrawn article, One amended meeting minute, one labeled drawer at a time. But what she didn't yet know was why now. Why had the purge escalated in the final years before Klein's retirement? Why were files still vanishing after she left? And perhaps most unsettling, was someone helping her keep the work going? The woman who never let go. Marjorie Klein retired in 1971, but she never really left the library. According to library aides and custodians, she visited every Thursday afternoon, carried her own key approved by the town council as a lifetime access courtesy, had a small, unmarked desk in the basement office, was allowed to handle historical categorization tasks. This arrangement was seen as harmless by the library board. After all, Klein had been the custodian of town knowledge for nearly half a century. Letting her help with legacy files seemed more like honoring tradition than endorsing control. But Melissa saw it differently. She wasn't archiving history, she was auditing it. The 1955 Quiet Scandal. One document stood out from the rediscovered boxes, a 1955 citizen complaint letter signed by 14 black residents of Danbridge. The letter detailed discriminatory zoning that had effectively corralled black families into substandard housing, blocking them from access to certain streets and resources. The accompanying town meeting transcript, typed and official-looking, made no mention of the complaint. It had been summarized as, several residents shared views on community housing standards. Council tabled further discussion. Melissa found this language repeated across other contentious issues. 1942, wartime funds misplaced reduced to budget variance. 1939, assault in the mayor's office listed as heated disagreement. 1961, school board discrimination complaint marked as community feedback. Again and again, the town's tensions had been sanitized, and Marjorie had made sure no one remembered the original words. The parallel catalog. Melissa's most chilling discovery came not in the basement, but in the public card catalog itself. Behind each physical drawer, tucked away like bookmarks, were index cards with tiny handwritten notations. Article incites discontent. Duplicative of earlier filing, RECAT. Misinformed, withdrawn. Public confidence impact high. These weren't cross-references, they were judgments. Klein had maintained a parallel internal catalog, a shadow system, annotating which pieces of history she considered dangerous, inaccurate, or best left uncirculated. It was like finding a diary written inside the reference system of an entire town. Institutional complicity. When Melissa brought her findings to the current head librarian, she was met with polite dismissal. Those materials are very old. I'm sure they were archived for preservation or relevance. When she brought the materials to the town council, she was told, Ms. Klein served this town longer than anyone. We're not interested in revisiting old drama. When she contacted a local journalist, she was warned off the record. You'd be digging into people's memories they don't want disturbed. The deeper she went, the more she realized. The town didn't just tolerate Klein's manipulation, it depended on it. A town built on clean records. In a strange twist, Danbridge had long benefited from its pristine historical image. Grant applications, tourism pamphlets, even school district rankings leaned on the town's unblemished record of civic cooperation. But that record was fake. It was built in part on what Klein had removed: scandals, disputes, mistakes, and crimes. Her removals weren't digital deletions. They were administrative invisibility. Perfectly legal, under the state's library policies at the time, which allowed local institutions discretion over non-essential or inflammatory documents. The files hadn't been stolen. They had been officially, deliberately unremembered. The unofficial assistant. Melissa began to suspect that someone currently employed at the library was helping Klein continue her work. She reviewed keycard logs and found an anomaly. Two people consistently accessed the backroom archive on Thursday mornings. One was a part-time aide, Jeremy Black, 26, soft-spoken, recently hired. The other, an override key listed only as MK000, one Marjorie Klein's legacy access code. Security footage was sparse, but one black and white clip showed Jeremy and Klein wheeling a cart of labeled boxes, each marked RECAT closed, into the basement. Jeremy later claimed, "She said it was just old stuff no one needed anymore. I didn't think to ask." The law responds quietly. Eventually, Melissa sent copies of the rediscovered documents to the Indiana State Historical Commission. While they had no authority to prosecute, they agreed to send an investigative committee to assess the situation. Their findings, though never made fully public, reportedly confirmed that over 200 historical records had been intentionally withheld or mislabeled. Klein's labeling system had influenced official record-keeping for over 30 years. Town grant documents had falsely claimed full archival compliance. But instead of legal action, the commission issued a recommendation that Danbridge review and modernize its historical documentation policies and retire all legacy filing systems. No charges, no formal consequences, just polite language and gentle suggestions. Danbridge didn't lose its funding. It simply promised to stop pretending its past had been spotless. Melissa's final interview with Klein. Before leaving town, Melissa returned to Klein's home for a final conversation. She brought one of the complaint letters, asked her directly, "Why delete this? Why silence these people?" Klein's response, "Because we were tired of fighting, of bad stories, of hearing that nothing was ever good enough. So I gave people a version of Danbridge they could believe in." Melissa left the interview shaken. Because for Klein, this wasn't deception. It was curation. A thought left hanging. Before Melissa left Danbridge for good, she wrote a brief letter to the town newspaper, a column that was ultimately never printed. In it, she posed a simple question. If you remove all the pain, the protest, the mistakes, what kind of history is left? Is it truth? Or is it nostalgia in disguise? The editor reportedly refused to publish it. Said it would stir up old wounds. The letter now lives in Melissa's archived thesis at Indiana University, labeled Danbridge, the town that filed itself away. By the time Melissa Grain packed up her research notes and left Danbridge, Indiana, in the fall of 1976, she had come to accept an uncomfortable truth. She hadn't uncovered a crime in the traditional sense. She had uncovered a coordinated cultural memory shift, carried out by a single individual and quietly supported by a community that didn't want to remember the things she tried to reintroduce. What Marjorie Klein erased wasn't just paper. She erased disagreement, conflict, shame, and perhaps most disturbingly, diversity of memory. But the final part of the story is less about discovery and more about consequences. Because what happens when a town builds its sense of self on selective memory? Postscript, the town that forgot its fire. In early 1977, 6 months after Melissa's departure, Danbridge submitted an application to become a historical heritage site through the Indiana Office of Tourism. As part of the process, the town was required to submit verified documentation of its key historical events and preserved buildings. The application was rejected. The reason? The town had no surviving record of its 1896 courthouse fire, which had been a defining event in Danbridge's growth and civic identity. That fire had destroyed the original town charter and led to the construction of the now iconic limestone government building. For decades, school children had been taught about the fire, and reenactments were held at the local fair. But in Marjorie Klein's private notes, unearthed by Melissa, the fire was labeled unverified oral narrative, no legal documentation, removed from official history index. Klein had removed all references to the fire in the official town archive between 1958 and 1970, believing that such events encouraged melodrama and over-romanticized civic trauma. The application's failure sent a ripple of confusion through the community. No one could understand why their most cherished historical memory had vanished. Until Melissa published her thesis. The thesis that made waves. In 1978, Melissa's graduate thesis, titled Civic Silence, The Deliberate Absence of Memory in Rural Archives, was published in a small academic journal. It was part research, part exposé, and part memoir of her months in Danbridge. Key excerpts were picked up by a regional newspaper. This time, the town couldn't ignore it. A slow outrage began to build not just at Klein, but at the realization that their town history had become a curated fiction. If that fire didn't happen, what else didn't happen? One resident asked. Was my grandfather's protest ever recorded? What happened to the stories of the Spanish flu outbreak here? Said another. A special town committee was formed to begin the painstaking process of reconstructing Danbridge's missing history. But it wouldn't be easy. Entire decades of council records were gone. Microfilms had been spliced and resealed, some even chemically faded. And no backups existed. The only full copy of the pre-1950 Danbridge Sentinel was in Melissa's thesis archive, in a university box labeled Field Evidence. Marjorie Klein's final chapter. Klein died in 1983 at the age of 77. She never spoke publicly about the erasures again. At her funeral, which was well attended, many remembered her as the soul of the library. Some still defended her. She made the shelves feel sacred, said one local. She kept us from becoming a gossip town, said another. But others had different opinions. One council member noted quietly, "There's a difference between editing history and deleting it." Melissa never returned to Danbridge. But shortly after Klein's death, a small, handwritten envelope was mailed to her from an unknown address. Inside was a single index card. On it, "History is heavy. Some people don't want to carry it. So I did." It was unsigned, but the handwriting matched the margin notes Melissa had seen in hundreds of catalog cards. Memory and the law. Legally, no charges were ever filed. The destruction and recategorization of public documents at the time were governed by local discretion laws, which allowed head librarians in towns under 5,000 residents to manage archives, as deemed beneficial for civic order and space preservation. Klein had operated within those laws, but her influence had exceeded them. So in 1984, Indiana passed a revised Public Records Protection Act, which mandated all town meeting minutes be copied to state archives quarterly. A minimum of 10 years' worth of local newspapers be maintained in both physical and digital formats. Private alterations of catalog systems to be logged and reviewed biannually. Retired librarians and civil clerks to return all archival keys within 90 days. Unofficially, it was called the Klein Rule. The town that remembered. Years later, Danbridge made an effort to reclaim its memory. Local high school students worked with the state to recompile lost events. Oral history booths were set up at the town fair. A new wing of the library was added, named not for Klein, but for Edith Miller, a black schoolteacher whose letters, once buried in Klein's RECAT box, became the foundation of the town's rebuilt civil rights record. and a single display case was added to the library lobby. Inside, a faded article about the 1896 fire, a photo of the courthouse reconstruction, a letter from a resident once accused of unnecessary complaint, and a label typed in black font on white tape that reads, "The accession truths now returned." Final reflection. This wasn't a story about forgery, or theft, or violence. It was a story about control, about a librarian who believed that order required silence, that civic peace meant narrative management, that truth could be reduced to what fits in a drawer. But history isn't made of drawers. It's made of discord and mistakes and shouting and healing. And no matter how many labels you print, some stories always find their way back to the shelf. In the early morning hours of March 2002, a streetlight in the town of Wexley, Oregon, collapsed onto a perfectly parked Buick LeSabre. The damage was minor, no one was injured, and the only real casualty was the Buick's hood ornament, which snapped clean off and landed in a nearby puddle. Police filed a simple report: infrastructure fatigue, wind stress, no foul play. Public Works crews arrived 2 hours later, cut the bent aluminum pole into sections, and carted it off without ceremony. End of story. Except that 3 weeks later, the owner of the Buick, Gerald W. Pruitt, filed an insurance claim for $68,000, citing severe structural damage, electrical fire hazard, and emotional distress. The adjuster, confused by the amount, opened an investigation. By the time it was over, Gerald's claim had unraveled a multi-year insurance fraud scheme so absurdly niche, it would become known in investigative circles as pole tapping. And what started with one broken streetlight would uncover dozens of cases across 3 states, hundreds of fraudulent claims, and one of the quietest, strangest insurance crimes in recent memory. A very particular man. Gerald Pruitt was not what you'd call a typical scammer. He was 63, drove under the speed limit, used a flip phone, and had worn the same members-only jacket since the mid-90s. He lived alone in a split-level ranch house filled with electrical diagrams, postage stamps, and antique model trains. To his neighbors, he was quirky but harmless. He attended city council meetings, always voted, and once complained to the mayor that the library's clocks were mildly miscalibrated. But Gerald also had 4 ongoing homeowners' claims, 2 of which had recently paid out for damage from structural shift due to city-related vibrations. This detail would prove telling. The claim that raised eyebrows. When the insurance adjuster Alana Chen reviewed Gerald's streetlight incident, she noticed a few inconsistencies. The photos Gerald submitted were taken at dusk, even though the pole fell at dawn. The Buick had damage on the opposite side of where the pole landed. The invoice for electrical repairs listed parts not found in that model year of the car. When asked for further documentation, Gerald submitted a 17-page letter, complete with hand-drawn schematics showing how electrical trauma from the pole had caused a molecular shift in the fender alignment. Alana was no rookie. She knew eccentricity when she saw it. But she also knew this wasn't just weird, it was intentional. A pattern emerges. Intrigued, Alana searched Gerald's name in the National Insurance Database. What she found raised red flags. A 1999 claim for garage wall collapse due to poorly stabilized city sewer line vibration. A 2000 claim for microwave malfunction due to proximity to municipal cell tower. A 2001 claim for minor injuries due to reflective glare from newly installed parking meters. Each claim was filed against a municipal entity, not a private person. And each claim had one thing in common: a minor city infrastructure change, followed by a personal loss, followed by an outsized insurance claim. They weren't random. They were engineered. The electrical pole map. When Alana dug deeper into the 2002 streetlight claim, she visited the Public Works office. There, she met an intern, Carlos Medina, 22, who had been logging city pole replacements for a senior capstone project. Carlos had mapped every electrical pole collapse in Wexley between 1997 and 2002. There were 6. That was expected. What wasn't expected? All 6 were within 2 blocks of properties owned or rented by Gerald Prewitt. Carlos called it a weird coincidence. Alana called it insurance fraud with a circuit diagram. Pole tapping, a new kind of scam. As the case unfolded, investigators developed a theory. Gerald had spent years quietly weakening city infrastructure, specifically aging streetlights and electrical poles so that they would collapse in convenient ways. His method: use a tension cutter, commonly found in amateur radio repair kits, to loosen internal bolts in light poles at night. Wait for rain, wind, or time to take its toll. When the pole inevitably failed, park his car or store property nearby to collect damage. File a highly technical claim, complete with obscure terminology and jargon, making adjusters wary of pushing back. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't fast. But it was untraceable until now. A new lead. An anonymous tip later revealed to be Carlos led investigators to an unregistered storage unit Gerald had rented under the name J.W. Peterson. Inside they found 3 dismantled city light poles, a stack of photocopied engineering manuals, obsolete municipal repair stickers, 14 fake damage reports with unfiled city logos, and a spiral notebook labeled Unstable Structures Viable Targets. Each page listed a date, address, weather condition, and a short note. Pole 117B, slight lean. Nearby transformer box creates good noise cover. Fencing near hydrant is rotted opportunity to tie claim to rust. The psychology of overdocumentation. One behavioral expert later testified that Gerald's most powerful weapon wasn't his tools. It was his paperwork. The average claim adjuster deals with low-effort scams, fake receipts, blurry photos. Gerald used overdocumentation as camouflage. His claims looked so complicated that most adjusters passed them just to avoid the bureaucratic rabbit hole. It worked for years, until someone noticed he had never once filed a claim involving a person. Only things. Only infrastructure. Always the city's fault. The arrest. Gerald Prewitt was arrested on June 14, 2003, after surveillance caught him using a wrench on a lamp post at 3:27 a.m. When questioned, he didn't deny it. He simply said, "The base was already compromised. I was merely encouraging the inevitable." He was charged with wire fraud, filing false insurance claims, vandalism of public property, possession of forged municipal documents. In total, his schemes had defrauded insurers and municipalities of an estimated $312,000 over 7 years. A thought left flickering. During his trial, Gerald asked to read a statement. In it, he said, "Our cities are full of neglected structures. I simply introduced consequence to complacency. If a pole leans long enough, someone should push it before it hurts somebody." When asked why he always parked near them, he smiled. Someone had to volunteer. When Gerald Prewitt was arrested for tampering with a city-owned light pole in the early morning hours of June 14, 2003, investigators assumed they were dealing with an eccentric but minor fraudster. Instead, what unfolded over the following months was the discovery of one of the most methodical, quietly destructive, and shockingly overlooked fraud operations the state of Oregon had ever seen. This wasn't just insurance fraud. It was a campaign of subtle civic sabotage, all engineered by a man who knew how to exploit bureaucratic indifference, infrastructure aging, and the psychology of city trust. The pole collapse network. After Gerald's arrest, the Oregon Department of Justice assembled a task force to re-examine municipal records. They quickly found something unusual. Wexley's infrastructure logs showed anomalously high failure rates for street lights, electrical distribution boxes, hydrants, sidewalk signage, municipal fencing. Over a span of 5 years, dozens of collapses and failures had occurred in quiet parts of the city, often during off hours, usually with no witnesses, and always followed by one or more insurance claims. Cross-referencing with Pruitt's known addresses revealed a shocking detail. 74% of failures had occurred within a 3-block radius of a property Gerald either owned, rented, or had recently sold. And in 11 separate incidents, he had submitted damage claims within 24 hours of the collapse. The method of passive interference. Pruitt's technique was given a name by investigators: passive interference fraud. Instead of aggressively destroying public property, Pruitt would identify vulnerable structures, tilting poles, corroded hydrants, leaning signage. Apply minor mechanical interference such as loosening bolts, tapping supports, or filing notches into metal joints. Wait for environmental factors, wind, moisture, traffic vibration, to complete the failure. Document damage immediately, often before city crews even arrived. File a detailed claim, emphasizing municipal negligence. It was like trapping the city in a tripwire of its own apathy. The Blue Notebook. Among the most chilling discoveries was a blue spiral-bound notebook retrieved from Pruitt's storage unit. Labeled only Risk Points, it contained over 200 entries. Each entry listed a nearby structure, pole 118A, signpost on 3rd and Langdon. Type of material, aluminum composite, galvanized steel. Date of last inspection, as publicly reported. Estimated failure timeline. Vulnerability score from 1 to 5. Ideal damage scenario. One example. Pole 74C. Material cast aluminum. Last inspected, 1995. V-score 4. Ideal, minor collapse during windstorm front quarter panel / passenger mirror. Tools, 11 socket notch file, rust accelerant. These weren't notes. They were instructions. Forensic confirmation. Forensic engineers examined 5 poles involved in Pruitt's insurance claims that had been stored in a city depot. Using microscopy and structural stress analysis, they confirmed tool markings consistent with tampering, bolts that had been loosened in a manner inconsistent with environmental decay, deliberate notching to encourage stress fractures. In one case, the pole had been weakened from the inside by inserting a saline solution into the screw housing, accelerating rust. None of these manipulations were visible without disassembly. This was fraud beneath the surface, a blueprint for manufactured accidents that looked like wear and tear. Why the city never noticed? Because Pruitt was too good at appearing unlucky. His car just happened to be parked under poles during windstorms. His trash bins just happened to be crushed when a sign toppled. His garden fence just happened to be dented by a collapsed transformer box. And because his claims were never large enough to demand deep investigation, he often received settlements quickly, usually between $2,000 and $10,000. Individually, not worth legal pursuit. Collectively, he defrauded insurers, the city, and various public works departments of over $300,000. Carlos Medina's role. It was Carlos Medina, the intern who had originally mapped the pole collapses, who became instrumental in connecting the dots. He testified that during his own review, he had seen Gerald attending council meetings, often asking questions about upcoming pole replacements and inspection timelines. He wasn't just tampering with hardware, Carlos said. He was watching policy, so he could plan where the gaps would be. Pruitt used public knowledge meeting minutes, inspection schedules, and zoning permits to identify when poles wouldn't be reviewed for months or years. He didn't hide from city records. He used them as his blueprint. The trial. In 2005, Gerald W. Pruitt stood trial for 17 counts of insurance fraud, 13 counts of vandalizing municipal property, multiple counts of submitting falsified documents, intentional public endangerment. His defense: he insisted that he had merely documented civic failure and was exercising his right to compensation as a citizen harmed by poor infrastructure. When asked why all the collapses seemed to benefit him alone, he replied, "Because I noticed what no one else did." Ultimately, he was found guilty and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, with a restitution order of $248,000. Postscript: damage control. The city of Wexley launched a full-scale audit of public infrastructure following the case. 47 poles were found to have been subtly compromised. $1.2 million was allocated to accelerated inspection and replacement. City workers were retrained on spotting tool-based interference. Insurance companies updated claim protocols with a new flag. Pruitt pattern: repeat infrastructure proximity claim. Carlos Medina was later hired full-time by the city's Risk and Infrastructure Division. His first internal report, titled simply, "What Gerald Taught Us." Reflection: some crimes shake cities with violence, others with scandal. But Gerald Pruitt's crime was a whisper. He exploited trust. He preyed on bureaucracy. He hid malice beneath politeness and municipal blueprints. And in the end, he taught cities that not all threats wear masks. Some wear cardigans and carry a wrench. By the time Gerald W. Pruitt sat in the Oregon State Correctional Facility Library in 2007, he was known to fellow inmates as the Professor. He never raised his voice, never cursed, rarely left the law book section. And yet, his legacy was more disruptive than many men locked up for violent offenses. Gerald hadn't just gamed the system. He had charted it methodically, obsessively, and left behind a legacy that was still causing ripples through municipalities across the Pacific Northwest. Because by the end of his criminal operation, Gerald wasn't only staging accidents. He was predicting them. The infrastructure collapse map. After his conviction, a search of a secondary storage unit in Gresham, Oregon revealed a hand-assembled wall map that spanned 14 feet. Pinned and strung together by red thread, it marked known pole failures across Oregon, frequency of municipal inspections, terrain stability, construction projects, budget deficits by department. Gerald had cross-referenced all of it down to rainfall pattern and road repair delays. What authorities realized was chilling. Pruitt had calculated exactly where and when public infrastructure would likely fail and moved his own assets into position before it happened. He called it his reactive claim grid. The system delays its own repairs. In a rare post-sentencing interview, Pruitt explained his mindset to a local journalist from the Salem Courier. "Cities wait until things break. I simply got there before they did." When asked if he considered his actions sabotage, he shook his head. "I didn't destroy anything. I observed. I nudged what was already on the brink." But when pressed on why he filed the claims under false pretenses, why he deliberately staged damage, his tone sharpened. "You think they'd have listened if I just told them their polls were failing?" He leaned forward and added, "There's no consequence without paperwork. I gave them paperwork." A broader pattern emerges. Following Pruitt's case, the FBI, in conjunction with the National Insurance Crime Bureau, NICB, launched a quiet probe into other cities that had seen a sudden uptick in infrastructure-related claims. What they found were two more suspects operating in similar fashion, albeit less effectively than Gerald. Both had copied elements of Pruitt's tactics. One used electromagnetic pulse theory to claim home appliance damage after nearby street lamp outages. Another staged minor bike accidents next to failing sidewalks and sued for wheel damage and emotional trauma. Neither had Pruitt's technical prowess or patience. But they had something else. They had been inspired by reading about his case. This raised uncomfortable questions in law enforcement circles. Could Pruitt's methods be copied at scale? Were there others who'd never been caught? Had he started a blue-collar blueprint for civic exploitation? The insurance industry response. In 2006, the NICB released a new fraud watch guide, which included a dedicated chapter. Civic Decay Exploitation, Lessons from Wexley. Insurers were instructed to flag claims involving repeated municipal proximity, require engineering review for infrastructure-based incidents, audit serial claimants every 6 months, cross-reference GIS maps with property records to identify clustering. Meanwhile, city managers were advised to maintain more transparent inspection logs to prevent them from being used as blueprints for exploitation. Pruitt hadn't just scammed the system. He had exposed its deepest blind spots. The unlikely folk hero. In online forums for disaster preppers and civic watchdogs, Gerald Pruitt's story took on a strange new life. He was cited not as a fraud, but as a prophet, a man who highlighted infrastructural neglect and governmental inaction. Conspiracy threads labeled him the streetlight canary, the auditor without a badge, America's first civic saboteur. There were even novelty t-shirts. Melissa Palmer, a public works coordinator in Tacoma, put it best during a 2010 conference on fraud prevention. "It's unsettling how many people admire him. He didn't solve problems, he exploited them, but we let those problems fester, that part, on us." What he left behind. Pruitt was paroled in 2011 after serving 6 years. He disappeared quietly, no interviews, no book deal, no public re-entry. Rumors persist. Some say he moved to Idaho under a new name. Others claim he took a job as a contractor with a firm specializing in infrastructure risk modeling. One popular theory: he's working for the government, helping design better fraud detection systems, though no proof supports this. What is known is that shortly after his release, several small towns in Washington state received anonymous reports outlining vulnerable public structures with proposed inspection schedules. Each typed report ended with the same closing line: "Prediction is prevention, use it." No name, no return address, just a map with red dots and faded thread marks. Final reflection: Gerald Pruitt didn't steal jewels. He didn't stage dramatic crashes. He didn't hack databases. He studied a city's silence, watched its cracks spread, and turned its apathy into opportunity. He made the system confess by letting it break itself. And if there's a lesson in his story, it's this: sometimes the most dangerous criminal isn't the one who breaks in. It's the one who walks in, clipboard in hand, and knows exactly where you've stopped looking. On a cloudy October morning in 1989, A golden retriever named Charlie ran out of a collapsing barn in rural Hanover County, Virginia, with what looked like a tattered glove in his mouth. His owner, Nancy Tiller, assumed the old barn on the edge of her property had finally given in to years of wood rot and disuse. She followed Charlie inside to pull him away from the debris. What she found instead, half covered by the barn's collapsed floorboards, was a human femur. Wrapped loosely in what had once been a thick canvas sack, the remains were partially mummified. The smell wasn't as strong as you might expect, but it was unmistakable. Nancy called the police. By sundown, the quiet, horse farm town of New Ash, population just under 3,000, had a full homicide investigation underway. A body without a case. The first problem investigators encountered was simple. There were no missing persons in New Ash. Not recently. Not in the last decade. Not even historically. The only open cold case within a 100-mile radius was a missing welder from Richmond in 1972, and he'd vanished 15 years earlier with a trail that went cold outside a truck stop. The body found in Nancy Tiller's barn was estimated to have been buried no more than 6 years prior. Forensics gave them: male, age 35-50. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the base of the skull. Signs of post-mortem relocation. Unusual dental work. Gold bridge, slightly outdated even by 1980s standards. And that was it. No ID. No wallet. No clothing besides the remnants of the canvas bag. The only lead. The dog. Charlie's obsession. Charlie the golden retriever had always been quirky, as Nancy described. He refused to sleep indoors. He barked at wind chimes. He would sit for hours facing the barn, tail motionless, as if waiting for something. For 3 years, Nancy had assumed it was just dog behavior until the day he pulled out a bone. But that wasn't the only time he'd shown interest in the barn. In 1987, a visiting cousin had seen Charlie pawing at the boards inside. The dog had even dragged out an old rubber boot once and dropped it in the yard. The boot was written off as garbage. But when investigators unearthed the rest of the body, they found a matching boot, partially fused to the deteriorated lower leg. Charlie hadn't found the body by accident. He'd been trying to show them for years. The farm's previous owner, the Tiller family, had moved into the property in 1986. The barn came with the land, but it had already been marked structurally unstable by a local surveyor. Before the Tillers, the property belonged to Joseph Jody Langtry, a reclusive former truck mechanic who lived alone and died of a heart attack in 1985. Langtry had no known family. His will, scrawled on a diner napkin and legally recognized due to witnesses, left the land to the county for sale. His name had never appeared in criminal records. And yet, when police obtained an old photo of Langtry and showed it to Nancy, she paused. "That's the man Charlie barked at," she said. "A few months before we moved in, I thought it was just a neighbor walking the woods." But Jody Langtry had been dead for over a year at that point. Or had he? The skeletal detail no one expected. Forensics took longer than expected, partly because the body showed signs of a first burial, then reburial. There was mud caked inside the eye sockets and insect activity, consistent with above-ground exposure before final decomposition under floorboards. Even more puzzling, traces of formaldehyde and paraffin wax in the upper clothing fibers. These weren't consistent with nature. They were consistent with preservation. Somehow, someone had attempted unsuccessfully to embalm or preserve the body, at least partially. This wasn't just a hidden murder. It was a murder followed by a deeply strange attempt to preserve the body, then hide it again. A dog and a delivery route. When police began asking around about Jody Langtry's past, one odd fact surfaced repeatedly. He used to take odd jobs delivering small freight. He worked mostly with outdated vehicles, and he had a reputation for being a little too friendly with county morgue workers in nearby Ashland. One retired pathologist remembered Jody hanging around the loading dock, asking questions about the old coolers. Another recalled him offering to fix a refrigeration unit in exchange for free storage of taxidermy specimens, though it was unclear if he was joking. What became clear? Jody Langtry had an interest in preservation and access to people who worked around bodies. The other dogs. When local animal control reviewed past reports, another curiosity came to light. Two previous owners of dogs who had lived on the Langtry property before Nancy had reported odd behavior from their animals. One dog repeatedly dug in the same spot behind the barn. Another had to be rehomed after displaying distress behaviors, barking, refusing to eat, and hiding in closets. A neighbor's collie was found staring into the barn at night, whining, tail between its legs. This wasn't just Charlie. The dogs had known something for years, and no one had listened. A quiet cemetery. A final tip came from a retired graveyard worker named Alan Pope, who had once been called to remove and relocate headstones from a defunct family plot on the edge of Hanover County in 1984. Pope remembered Langtry clearly. He wanted to know what happened to the bodies after exhumation, not the stones, the bodies. He asked if anyone took them home. When asked what he told him, Pope shrugged. Told him that's illegal, obviously, but Jody just smiled, said, "Yeah, I figured." A thought that won't sit still. By the time section 1 of this story closes, the mystery remains unresolved. Who was the man in the barn? Why did Langtry, by all accounts, a loner mechanic, seem interested in morgues, burials, and preservation? And why would a man with no criminal history hide a body beneath his barn floorboards? More importantly, what else did Charlie know? Because he never stopped returning to the barn, even after the body was removed. And every night, he would sit at the collapsed threshold, ears perked toward something only he could hear. The body in the barn had shaken new ash, but for authorities and forensic teams, it was only the start of a deeper, stranger case. A man had been murdered, his body hidden, possibly preserved, and no one could even tell who he was. And the only thing leading investigators forward. A dog. One who refused to stop watching the barn. But this wasn't just a story about a missing man. It was about what happens when someone studies death, not to prevent it, but to practice it. Jody Langtry's workshop. Behind the farmhouse, obscured by years of overgrowth, a padlocked shed sat rusting in the trees. No one had paid much attention to it. The tillers assumed it was for tools, but they had never opened it, figuring the county had cleaned it out during the sale. But it hadn't been touched. The padlock was original. Police obtained a warrant and forced it open on November 4th, 1989. Inside were 2 large freezers, non-functional, stacks of dog-eared embalming manuals, veterinary textbooks with marginal notes, a blackboard with chemical formulas, many crossed out, rewritten, recalculated, and a crude wooden autopsy table, stained and warped with age. On a nearby shelf sat labeled jars of chemicals: formaldehyde, sodium nitrate, acetone, a thick cloudy jar marked bone softener A. There were no animals in the shed, but there were blueprints not for buildings, but for refrigeration systems and cooling compartments designed for bodies. And tucked in a drawer beneath the workbench was a file labeled "Practice, do not keep." Inside, photographs. The practice photos. The images were grainy, likely taken with a Polaroid. Many were water damaged, but what remained was deeply disturbing. Several showed animals, posed on the workbench mid-dissection. Others displayed partial human remains, legs or arms, in staged setups, some seemingly posed to mimic accidents. One photograph was of a jawbone set into plaster, with teeth labeled using dental charting codes. Another showed a man's torso, turned sideways on the barn floor, a crude measuring tape across the chest. And finally, one image showed the canvas sack, still clean, with a note card resting on top that read, "Test fit successful, awaiting deterioration curve." Investigators now knew Langtry had been studying decomposition, and at least once he had used a real human body. Missing corpses. Further digging into county exhumation records revealed something more disturbing. In 1983, a cemetery cleanup had resulted in 5 unclaimed remains being relocated from a derelict family plot remains that were supposed to be cremated and stored by a regional contractor. But only 4 urns were documented as delivered. The 5th, known only as unidentified male 27, was signed out by a temp assistant who had worked only 2 weeks that year, using forged credentials. The name on the sign-out form, Joseph Langtry, signed with a looping, unfamiliar signature. It was a fake, but the intent was clear. He had accessed a corpse and possibly used it to test his preservation techniques. A second body. Weeks after the barn discovery, Charlie the golden retriever, still drawn to the same site, began scratching again. This time, he dug under a separate part of the collapsed barn flooring, several feet from the original site. And beneath a pile of debris, investigators found a wooden box sealed with rusted nails. Inside, bones, badly damaged, partial skeleton scattered and mixed with wood chips and what appeared to be lime dust. Tests confirmed it was another male, aged 20-35. Time of death estimated between 10 and 15 years earlier. There was no head. Dental records were impossible to verify. The bones had been burned, possibly as part of a failed cremation attempt. This second body had never been reported missing. There were no leads, no photos, no preserved tissue, a map and a motive. Among Langtry's effects was a hand-drawn map of cooling zones and moisture retention patterns across his property. It included timestamps, weather conditions, and tissue decay notes. It was annotated like a field study, one that began in the early 1980s and continued until just before his death. He wasn't just hiding bodies. He was learning from them. What was his motive? There was no cult, no customers, no known affiliation with academic institutions. But one note stood out, scribbled on the edge of a preservation diagram. No formal degree needed, just precision, just patience. Langtry wasn't trying to profit. He was trying to master something. Dogs remember. Throughout the investigation, Charlie continued his vigil. After the discovery of the second body, he no longer returned to the barn. But he would still wake suddenly at night, whining until he was let outside. Nancy Tiller, heartbroken and disturbed by what her property had revealed, eventually moved out of the farmhouse. She took Charlie with her to a cabin by the Shenandoah River. There he lived 3 more years. He never sat by a door again. He never barked without cause. And in his final weeks, Nancy said, he would stare out the window each evening, ears forward, quiet, alert, as if still watching for something no one else could see. Final thoughts. Who were the men buried beneath the barn? Why did Jody Langtry, who never once committed a documented crime, take such an obsessive interest in preservation? And perhaps more unsettling, what would have happened if Charlie hadn't pulled that bone? Because that dog didn't just find a body. He found a pattern, a silent ritual, a blueprint for what one man believed was a self-taught science in death. The final chapter in the strange case of the barn body, the quiet mechanic, and the golden retriever who refused to give up, unfolded not in a courtroom but in a county archive building, under dim lighting and quiet suspicion. There were no arrests, no full confessions, no satisfying names carved into headstones. Only the weight of unanswered questions, and the haunting realization that what Jody Langtry did may have never been fully discovered. Because the more investigators looked, the more they began to wonder. Had they found the bodies he wanted them to find? Or just the ones he left behind? The final analysis. Forensic anthropologists were able to learn little from the second body, bones too fragmented, no traceable dental work, and DNA too degraded for matching against local databases. But they found something strange. The skull was missing, yes, but so were 3 vertebrae carefully cut. Microscopic scoring along the ribs suggested the use of non-commercial dissection tools, possibly hand-filed scalpels. Traces of paraffin wax along the inner femur hinted at experimental chemical sealing. Langtry wasn't experimenting on a corpse he'd merely wanted to hide. He was practicing a technique. One investigator, Dr. Elaine Harbers, summarized it in her field notes. Langtry wanted to understand preservation. Not for forensic science, not for study, but for control. He wanted to control how a body resisted nature. The Langtry Files. Months after the second body was discovered, investigators received an anonymous package. It was postmarked from Richmond, but the return address was fake. Inside was a manila envelope with only 3 items. A single Polaroid photograph of a dissection table with surgical gloves neatly arranged beside it. A hand-drawn schematic of a chest cavity, labeled with Langtry's familiar handwriting. Cavity wall seal integrity, test 8 revisit wax layer. A note. Not all of them were failed attempts. Look deeper, he kept records in the floor. The trapdoor. The barn was no longer standing, demolished after the first 2 discoveries for safety reasons. But Nancy Tiller, upon returning to the site with detectives, recalled one feature she had forgotten entirely. A small crawl space, once accessible by a loose floor panel under a feeding trough. The team dug there, revealing a narrow root cellar, roughly 5 feet deep and 6 feet across. Inside was a single metal filing cabinet. It had rusted nearly shut, but within it were 54 labeled folders, protected in plastic. Diagrams of arterial structures, timelines of decay at varying temperatures, anatomical sketches, some clearly copied from textbooks, others imagined, journal entries titled, June trial no soft tissue, wax mist failure, perfect silence, return to early methods. None of the entries mentioned names. None identified victims. But the chilling part, each file was marked with a trial number, not dates. The last file was labeled, Trial 9, recovered early. The missing trials. If Trial 9 was the body Charlie discovered, what happened to Trials 1 through 8? And why was Trial 9 labeled, recovered early? Was Langtry planning to dig it back up? Or was someone else continuing his work? That possibility haunted the task force, especially when one final disturbing discovery came in a report from an elderly nurse who had worked at a hospice clinic in 1984. She remembered Langtry visiting an ill cousin in palliative care. He had asked peculiar questions about post-death handling, body bags, and how long the facility stored unclaimed remains before removal. The cousin died days later. The body was collected by the funeral home. but when the mortuary attempted cremation, the body was missing. That incident had been quietly written off as a paperwork mix-up. But now, investigators began to suspect otherwise. Charlie's final act. After Charlie passed in 1993, Nancy Tiller had him cremated and kept his ashes in a brass urn. Years later, she told a local paper, "He didn't bark without reason. He didn't dig without purpose. And when he stopped barking, only then did I feel safe again." Charlie wasn't just a pet. He had seen something, heard something, smelled something everyone else had ignored. He found what no one knew to look for, and perhaps stopped something before it went further. Reflection, a stillness measured in years. The Lantry case never had a satisfying ending. The identity of the two men found beneath the barn was never confirmed. No other bodies were recovered. And yet his preserved notes showed intention, repetition, obsession, planning. He didn't kill for money. Not for passion. Not even for revenge. He killed to observe. To test. To control what happened after death, not during it. And somewhere along the way, he forgot that bodies are not tools. That silence under the floorboards does not equal peace.